Well, it looks like not Nevada. There was a rumor you were in Reno or something.
No, no, no. I'm actually in Pennsylvania.
Okay. All right. And it's Peter Jensen, who has generously offered to give us a little bit of his knowledge and insight on trail building. You're involved with the Trail Builders Association, is that right, Peter?
Yeah, I'm a member. I have been a member of the Professional Trail Builders Association since 2001.
Well, as you may have been prepped a little bit, we're looking at a couple of different bills, and one of them is H-85. I don't know whether you had a chance to look at it. It's a bill that it's what we call a short form bill, so there's not a lot of language explaining what would happen, but the idea is that any, broadly speaking, any state-funded trail development would include portion 10%, I think is the number we're working with, accessible. We built to be accessible. So we would welcome any thoughts you might have on what anything that we should know about trail building, which is fairly new to our committee.
Okay. All right. Let's see.
So if you wanted to start and introduce yourself formally for the record.
Sure. Okay. So I'm Peter Jensen. I have a business, trail building business, Peter S. Jensen and Associates LLC. I live in Washington, Vermont, and lived there since 2010. We work all over the Northeast. Back in the late 90s, I was on the board of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, and the U.S. Access Board at that time was creating a committee of 25 members, and they asked the Appalachian Trail Conservancy to be a part of that. And so I was selected to be a part of that. And that was a 2-year process. We met around the U.S. In various locations, basically putting together new guidelines for accessibility for beaches, campsites, picnic areas, and trails. And in 1999, there was a draft report that came out, and I started using that because I was trail building back then as well, to ground truth it. And then a couple years later, I was hired by the Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, to help them develop their what's called Forest Service Trail Accessibility Guidelines. And then I believe it was in November of either 2012 or 2013, I don't recall exactly, that the federal government approved these accessibility guidelines. So now they are within the Architectural Barriers Act, which was first enacted in 1968. And it only applies to federal facilities or federally funded projects. You're all familiar with the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. And at some point, the U.S. Access Board wants to combine the ADA and the ADA, so it's all under one law. But currently, these guidelines that were put out by the U.S. Access Board back then are best practices, or considered best practices outside the federal government. And I know a lot of states and some local municipalities have adopted the Forest Service guidelines. They work very well for trails. In fact, you may already be aware that the Recreational Trails Program, RTP, has a checkoff on those applications for accessibility. And so that's something that on the federal level, that's also looked at and, more favorably for funding for those. So what you're looking at potentially could also help, potentially match with some of the federal funding. But I have to tell you that, we build a lot of these, what we call all persons trails, because everybody can use them. Massachusetts Audubon, Nature Conservancy, regional land trusts. And when you build them, people really love it and they come to use those trails. A lot of times there's community involvement in the planning process, because it's great to have, the disabled community involved in that, so that they understand that, because there's not a great amount of information out there as to where they can go hiking. But it's coming. There are groups that are working on developing more information on that.
Great. Let's see. Questions from the committee? Representative Lipsky?
Yeah, hello, Peter. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too, Jed.
You get used to this, but I've known Peter professionally for over 30 years, I would say. But I recently had lunch with him at the State House maybe a month or so ago, and it was a real treat. He is someone who was an early pioneer in some of these initiatives, and the public access that he sort of was working all over the country on to try to bring it to what we're trying to do here, or these all access points may be appropriate for a certain distance. I'm thinking of, you talked about the Audubon Society. Do you ever do any work at Pleasant Valley Audubon in Lenox, or even get to some of these, a portion, whether it's 100 meters or a certain distance where the terrain makes it either physically, topographically feasible or economically feasible? Do you see with some of these trail projects that we have going on, they're often mountain bike, but they're walking and other uses? Mm-hmm. It's an applicable value to try to design some all access for portions. Like we had one project in Stowe to Bingham Falls. It's very steep, a lot of hydrologic challenges. It's very difficult for people that are not dealing with disabilities. So it ended up, the whole project, the new parking and that stuff was scrapped because it just could not comply with ADA requirements. Do you see any blended or hybrid approaches where a lot of the outdoor recreation, Vermont Trail?
Yeah, so I think that because these requirements are only, at the federal level, and as I mentioned earlier, they're best practices, and so you can do what you can, as best as you can to provide access. Now, let me give you an example of that. For example, sustainable trail development is really what it's all about these days. Building trails that are going to not have a long-term impact on the landscape. For example, I would probably say most of the trails in the Northeast are unsustainable. They pretty much go straight up. And sustainable trail development is really more about getting an alignment on terrain that is self-draining. And so you don't have any structures, any drainage structures, whether they're water bars or diversions or things like that. And so that right there takes out a barrier. I've met some folks in wheelchairs that are absolutely amazing. They can go places that you wouldn't believe because they have the ability. Now, that's not everybody, obviously, but I think that, some of these more remote trails, could be attractive to certain, wheelchair users, as long as the trail is, 36 inches wide. throughout most of the length. And the surface, firm and stable, that kind of thing. But the grades could be, perhaps not meet the Forest Service guidelines, but that may not be quite a hindrance. Once you get into things like steps, that becomes a bit of a showstopper for a bunch of folks. So there's opportunity, literally around every corner for creating better access. Maybe it's not 100%, but you can do something that will allow for more folks to, get out in the outdoors. I mean, there's, folks that walk with crutches, and there's over 54 million Americans that have a disability. And it's not necessarily, that they're in a wheelchair or walk with a cane or crutches or things like that. It could be a heart condition. That's a disability as well. Or it could be a breathing issue. And so these kinds of trails are really designed to accommodate all kinds of disabilities.
Peter, you mentioned a moment ago the width of the trail and the surface being firm. Can you talk a little bit more about surface materials?
Sure. What we, if we're talking about a full all persons trail, we like to use, a crushed aggregate, hard rock that's crushed down to 1/2 to 3/8 minus in size. Preferably not limestone, because that, when it gets wet, gets greasy and sticks to wheels, stroller wheels or wheelchair wheels, that kind of thing, even boots. But I have seen some really good stuff, and we've used some of it. For example, we did a section of All Persons Trail down in Woodstock on the Faulkner Trail, the lower part of the Faulkner Trail. And that came out of a quarry over in New Hampshire. It's excellent material for using for a trail surface. So that's most of the time we're ending up importing materials for surfacing. The natural material can work if the soils are just right. That's actually what I studied in college, was soil science. The soils are so variable across the landscape, and certainly in Vermont, where we've got lots of glacial till soil, some places would work really well, but once you introduce too much moisture into them, they become plastic, and that's just going to get to be kind of gooey and not attractive for people, and then they tend to try to avoid it and go around it, causing more damage. So that's why we prefer and recommend that, right from the get-go to surface a trail that's going to be used by everyone.
And if you were building a trail that the intent was not, for whatever reason, to have it be accessible to all people, an all persons trail, would you surface it would you be using any kind of a surface, or would it just be typically the natural material?
typically the soil that's there? Absolutely. Yeah. And in those sections where you might have poorer soils, of course, in the design process you want to try to avoid that, but there may have to be a little bit of hardening in places to get through there, or some kind of a structure. I'm thinking wetlands, for example, where you might have to install a boardwalk to get through that.
Other questions? Representative O'Brien?
Peter, it seems like we all love these long trails, like the Appalachian Trail, the Long Trail, the Catamount Trail. Has there ever been any talk of, a really challenging sort of all-persons trail, so that, even in a wheelchair, you could do, a 100-mile trail with accessible huts along?
That's a great question. That would be quite a project. And, is it feasible? Sure. How much does it cost? I don't know. Be a lot of money, but, it would be possible to do that. It would be very cool to have, something like that. I know that or have heard of the Vermont Huts, and it would be interesting to see if there was an ability to, connect two huts that with a section of trail that would be multi-use. I just today got an email from Professional Trail Builders Association about the Velomont Trail up in Braintree. That's going out to bid, and they're looking for bidders on that. That would be an interesting project to work on.
Representative Lipsky.
Peter, this gentleman we had testimony this morning by maybe he's the visionary behind Velo Trail. He's constructed some huts, and he talked about some ADA accessible portions. Name was Thompson. It's on the YouTube, I guess. It may be what you were talking about. But federal dollars. You've worked on federal land, and it's very possible that Vermont, there may be some matching federal dollars. One testimony we've had is a lot of challenges we have are parking lots, access, trailheads, access points, and parking. They take real dollars to create and build right and sustainable. And very often there might be a portion of, if we got ADA available parking, there may be a certain portion or length of access. Do you know of any federal dollar programs that might be helpful for Vermont or the Vermont Trails and Greenways?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the recreational trail program. I believe, I haven't spoken to Cheryl in a while, but Cheryl Winnie is the one who, at least in the past, has administered that program in Vermont. Through Forests and Parks. So the other thing that we should be clear about is that, the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, has nothing to do with trails. Now, you mentioned parking lots, and that's where ADA does apply. But once you get off of a parking lot, ADA no longer applies unless you're creating a route to, for example, a fishing platform. This is something that, some folks don't really understand, is that once you talk about wanting a fishing platform, then the ADA kicks in, because fishing platforms are specifically mentioned in the ADA law. And so therefore, it's not a trail to a fishing platform, it's an access route. And that is a much stricter set of design and build standards for that. I'll give you a quick example. In terms of tread grades, ADA, once you go over 5%, it becomes a ramp, and that's going to require a handrail, not a guardrail, but a handrail. The same thing with cross slope. The federal trail standards, 5% is the max cross slope. With ADA access routes, it's 2%, which is a real challenge to try to drain on a natural surface trail, because of the roughness of that tread surface.
Thank you.
Peter, as far as the guidelines, the federal guidelines go for accessibility, so again, you mentioned width, surface, grade. Are there others?
Yes. For example, openings. Think of bridge decks, boardwalk decks. There's a maximum half-inch opening. And from time to time, we run into conflict with permitting on that, having to do with light penetration through a structure, to the vegetation underneath. And we've successfully argued that, we can make the, if you want to call it, opacity of a boardwalk deck more by changing the dimension of the decking boards. You go to a lumber yard and buy decking, most of it's like 5.5 inches. We use a lot of black locust on our projects, and so it's all custom sawn, and we use 4-inch. And if you take, a 10-foot section of boardwalk and you compare 4-inch decking to 6-inch decking, you're increasing the light penetration by 30%. And so we've been able to, stick with that. That's been one sticking point for us in the past, but we sort of figured a workaround on that. Other things would be if the tread is less than 60 inches wide, then you also need passing spaces. And the requirement there is every 1,000 feet or so, but I find that to be a little bit too far. And a lot of times when we're building trail like that, we need places to pass our equipment, which is typically walk behind. And so we put them in logical locations and then just surface those so they become closer together. And I think people appreciate that a lot more. If you have, for example, 2 wheelchairs that, try to pass each other, they'll have a place to pass. Resting spaces, that's another requirement. And that's a pretty easy thing to do with a sustainable trail alignment, in that the grades are such that we have what we call grade reversals. Let's say, for example, you're going up a slope at 8% grade, and then you reverse grade for, maybe 8 or 10 feet at maybe 4%. That entire section of 4% is a rest, because a rest is defined as the width of the trail and 5% or less grade. So that one's pretty easy to achieve. Signage, there's also a signage piece in there in terms of providing access information. That's something that's been very successful. The idea is that everybody has their own level of ability and understanding of what their abilities are. And so once they become familiar with the language around access on trails, they have a greater understanding of what they're capable of. For example, that information would be, typical grades, maximum grades, cross slopes, any kinds of narrowing of the trail, that type of thing. Protruding objects is another one. That one is more of a human-made feature. Think of a trail sign, for example, that might be sticking into the trail corridor, and might be a problem for a sight-impaired person who won't see it.
Peter, can you? Sorry, go ahead and finish.
No, I was just going to say that there are construction workarounds on some of these things, and design. If you have to have a sign, you can make it so the trail bends around that and doesn't interfere with the path of travel for folks.
I'm wondering if there exists, and maybe somewhere within the halls of state government, there is sort of an inventory of trails in Vermont that are accessible, all persons trails.
It's a good question. I'm not aware of a list. I mean, like I said, we did one in Woodstock a number of years ago, and I don't know if you've spoken with Josh Ryan from Timber and Stone, but I know Josh has done a bunch of trails, especially for the Nature Conservancy in Vermont, and so they're out there. I just don't have a full grasp of where they are, all of them.
Great. Other questions anyone might have? Anything else that you would want to add, Peter, that we might be thinking about as we dig into this more?
I guess I'd like to understand a little more about, you know, the bill's intention. Is it basically to get more accessibility through state funding on projects, trail projects in Vermont? Is that the goal?
I would say yes, in short.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
yeah, if the state is going to invest in building out trails, that it set aside funding, set aside some amount, some percentage of those trails to be accessible.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a good goal. I mean, we are a pretty mountainous state. However, you know, it's we've built some trails, you know, fully accessible trails in some pretty interesting terrain. I don't know if anybody's ever been to Crotched Mountain over in New Hampshire, and we built a 2.5 mile trail system there back in the mid 2000s, and the same up in the Adirondacks at John Dillon Park. That was also 2.5 miles in length. And both of those places are enjoyed by thousands of people at this point.
We heard earlier this morning from another professional trail builder. I guess I knew there were people who built trails professionally, but in our little state, how big is the industry?
Well, I know there's a couple of mountain bike builders, and of course Josh Ryan and myself. You know, we do all manner of trails, you know, pedestrian and mostly pretty much all pedestrian, but also you know, accessible boardwalks, bridges, that type of thing. I think there are a couple of other folks out there. They're not members of the Professional Trail Builders Association yet, but I have heard of a few folks out there. It's a growing industry, and one of my goals in life is to really try to get more young folks involved. It's a challenging lifestyle because it does involve, you know, quite a bit of travel. I used to live in Western Mass, which is where Jed lived as well. And, you know, I kind of built built all the trails that were needed down there until a few years ago. But you know, you can't really stay in one place and be a trail builder professionally, you know, for the long term. So it does require, you know, this desire to travel and work in other places.
Yeah.
Representative.
Just one comment, Peter. You know, the Vermont outdoor recreation economic objective is, you know, from the governor's office, and it's diffused all over the state, getting people, the more diverse people, access to outdoor recreation, and some that doesn't require anything but a pair of shoes. You know, you don't need fancy bicycles or ski pass, you know, so
right.
It's seen as an economic driver. It attracts people of all demographics and introduce them to what the Green Mountain State offers a lot of, which is a lot of interesting windows into nature and our environment. So
I couldn't agree more. I think this, you know, it is a piece of an economic engine. And so, you know, I think however much, you know, public money, state money is invested in this, I think the return is going to be, you know, manyfold to the economy of Vermont. And even, you know, just short walks that people can do, you know, an evening walk along a section of river or out to a, you know, a waterfall or a view or, you know, that kind of thing. People love that stuff.
my last question would be, Are those deciduous trees behind you that are foliated?
Well, there's some white pine here. There's a lot of pitch pine, and there's black gum and black birch. That's kind of what's here.
Well, I see
I'm
some
actually-
green, maybe
Right.
200 yards behind you.
Now the shad bushes have just started blooming today, so
Shad
spring is
bush,
coming.
love
I
it.
guarantee it.
Great to see.
Peter, thank you for your time this afternoon.
Sure, you're very welcome, and let me know if I can be of any further help.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Alrighty. Have a good day.
Great.
You know, doesn't matter if we're on there or not, but Chairman Durfee, you mentioned the name Tad Ames, or George Waslocki. Peter built Alder, worked with Berkshire Natural Resource County,
Yeah,
and I know that you have some connection to those folks.
yeah.
And it was, George is still alive. He's living in New Zealand, I think. Peter,
Okay.
I found that out a month or so.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's just,
What's the capital?
it's a small world.
I think we're all set, Laura.